Dr. Stephen Howard is the Program Director for Archaeology and Anthropology at Eastern Wyoming College in Torrington. He has extensive experience in public archaeology as well as field and lab archaeology. He has worked at archaeological sites in Wyoming, Colorado, Texas, Ohio, and New York, and has taken students to the UK to work at a Roman villa site. Dr. Howard has been teaching archaeology and anthropology for nearly 20 years. Please welcome Dr. Steve Howard.
Thanks for having me. On short notice, I just happened to get done with the field school last week, so I had a little bit of time. So I said, well, yeah, sure, why not? Let's go over and talk about some ancient folks. I'm sure some of you may have come to hear about the Arapaho and the Cheyenne and the Lakota and Omaha, Pawnee, Kansas, all those other tribes. But I'm an archaeologist, and I work a little bit earlier than that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about their ancestors. Okay, we're not really sure exactly how the tribes, the historic tribes, are related to the peoples that came before them. We do have some hints from DNA and from cultural stories, oral traditions. Okay, so most of those tribes have an idea of where they came from, and they help us out with that. So, first of all, we'll talk about what we do know about those people and how we can figure that stuff out. So, we know about their technologies, we know about their subsistence patterns, their economic systems, their language, a little bit, their religion, okay, a little bit again, and the times that are involved, the time periods. Because does anyone know how far back the natives go here in Nebraska?
At least 10,000 years.
10,000? It's a little bit earlier than that, yeah. Up until recently, people thought that folks came over about 13,000 years ago across the land bridge. Okay, that's still a viable hypothesis, but around the country we are starting to see more and more evidence of earlier sites. So it's pushing back the time a little bit further than 13,000 and 13,500, back to around 14 or 15,000 perhaps, and possibly as old as 22,000. Okay, there are a few dates out there. Again, we're scientists. We have to go through this process of verification, and everyone's testing all this stuff out. So eventually we will have, a better grasp of just how old the earliest ancestors of the Native Americans are. Okay? Let's take a look at some of these things that we do know. Actually, let me talk about how we do know these things, first of all. Okay? Well, technology, we look at lithic analysis and ceramic analysis. We can actually do experimental archaeology to figure out what things were used for. So say we find a knife, or what we think is a knife, buried in the ground. We can create a replica of that, use it to cut different things with, and then compare the, is that me? Oh, okay. Then we compare the use wear that's on the edge of the knife that we cut, say wood or bone or meat or whatever with, and we compare that to the actual artifact that we found on the ground to see what it closely matches. Okay? We can never say for sure this exactly was used for this particular purpose, but we can say this most likely was used for this purpose because it matches the use wear pattern that we find when we do it, right? When we use the same material to cut the same thing. Ceramic analysis can tell us a little bit about what they ate, right? Where they got their clay from, things like that, right? Time periods ceramics are important for figuring out how old a date or a site is, right? What it dates to. Paleoethnobotany is looking at what they ate again, but looking at the actual seeds and stuff that were left at archaeological sites. So we have macro analysis that looks at things like peach pits and corn kernels and seeds and things like that. And then we also have something called palynology, which looks at even smaller particles that we call microliths. Okay, and these are little, there's a couple of different kinds. We've got pollens, and we also have these little silicone particles that come inside plants. They're actually a waste product of the plant, but when the plant excretes its waste, it squeezes it between the cells, and then it takes on a particular shape for each plant. So we can tell what kind of plant created that little waste product, basically. It's a silica particle. Okay? We also have zooarchaeology, and you can guess what that is, right? Look at the animals, right, that they use for a lot of different reasons, right? They can have pack animals, or they can have, food, right? For language, we turn to linguistics, which is another division of anthropology. Archaeology is also a part of anthropology. Linguistics looks at the language families that modern Native American languages are from. Okay, so we can look at a little bit about how they're related to each other. Now, we can't get much past language families in the past. Like, we can't say, this is Seneca versus Mohawk. They're both part of the Iroquoian language family, but they're as different as French and Spanish. Okay? Kind of similar, but not the same. So an Iroquoian speaker of Seneca might not understand a speaker of Mohawk, for example. Okay? And then we have ethnoarchaeology. Ethnoarchaeology is when we look at groups that had the same lifeways that we see in the past. So, for example, a lot of the groups that lived around here for thousands of years, actually, were hunter-gatherers or foragers. Okay? And we have ethnographic records of foragers that existed up into the present day. So we can compare the kinds of tools that we find at ancient sites, and we can look at the modern sites or the recent sites and compare their use. Okay? These produce hypotheses that we use, and we test those hypotheses to figure out the best explanation for what a tool was used for or what a behavior was at a particular time. Okay? Whoops. And then finally, we have some dating methods that we'll go over to let you know how we find out how old something is. Right? Go. There it goes. Okay, so let's talk about technology first. Archaeology is generally associated with technology. Okay, it's not the only thing we look at, but it's the most flashy thing that we look at. So everyone looks for these kinds of things like this. Does anyone know what these are? Most of these are knives. But yeah, we generally call them spear or arrowheads in general terms, right? The function of them is usually not. Okay, especially arrowheads. Because arrowheads are very specific, actually. They're tips of arrows. If you put one of these on an arrow, what would happen? It wouldn't go very far. These are pretty heavy. These are arrowheads. Arrowheads are really tiny. These are actually arrowheads that are found around here. These are high plains arrowheads, notched high plains. We even have a replica of a metal one from the historic period. Okay, but they're very, very tiny. Most of the things that you find out there don't look like this. They may look kind of like this, but they're very, very much larger, aren't they? So we have knives. We have these. These only came in about 2,000 years ago. Prior to that, they used something else to hunt with. Something called an atlatl. You know what that is? Yeah, it's a thing that you hold in your hand. It has a little hook on the end, it's like a little stick, and you toss a spear with it. Technically, it's not really a spear. It's what we call a dart. Dart is essentially a fletched spear. It's got fletching on it. Feathers on the back. Okay? The darts that we have nowadays are little tiny ones you throw in the bar, right? Okay, they do have little things on the back, little fins, right? Well, it's the same idea, except these are much larger. Okay. And the spear launcher, or the dart launcher, is the term Atlatl comes from the language of Nahuatl, which is an Aztec language. And the reason that we call it that is because they used these things all the way up until the historic period. Most other groups gave them up once bows and arrows were introduced. Okay? Bows and arrows were much more efficient to make. The Atlatl itself wasn't too hard to make. You just had a stick and you put a little hook on it. Okay? But the darts were very expensive in terms of labor. They were labor intensive. It took about 2 weeks to produce a dart. They were so expensive that they actually used them with what we call a foreshaft, which is a little, a small wooden piece that the arrow or the dart point was actually attached to. Because the dart point and the foreshaft were expendable. Believe it or not, dart points don't take that long to make. You're sitting there for maybe an hour or so and you got one. Okay? But it takes 2 weeks to make one of those big long shafts. You gotta straighten it out, gotta make it exactly right, gotta fletch it, gotta do all this stuff to it. Okay? But an arrow, much smaller, much easier to do. The bow, same thing. It's much cheaper and it's efficient. The Atlatls are efficient as well. They will take down prey. Okay? But they didn't take as long to make. So most people preferred to make the arrows, and so they got rid of the darts. Okay? But the Aztec were traditionalists. They didn't get rid of it because they wanted to keep it around because it was part of their heritage. Okay, and this is one of the things that we get to when we talk about other things that archaeologists look at, is traditions and heritage and stuff like that. We see cultures that follow a particular religious regime, but changed through time. Okay, and a lot of things that we look at are changed through time, including artifacts. We go from, let's see, these guys. These are dart points. To those ones I showed you at first, the little tiny ones. Okay, these are some of these are small, but they're much thicker than an arrow point. Okay, and so these are for the darts, whereas those little arrow points are for the arrows. And you've got a change in technology, okay, based on the artifacts. Features as well. We have a lot of stone circles in the high plains. What are they used for? Anyone know?
TV rings.
TV rings? Okay. Some of them are TV rings.
There's religious use. There's also
Some of them are.
ceremonial or cooking.
Right.
Cooking circles.
And some actually going way back to a couple thousand years ago, or maybe 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, might have been a different kind of house altogether. We're still looking into all that stuff. Okay. We also find that the teepees that are marked by the teepee rings changed once horses were introduced. They got bigger. Okay, because it's easier to carry big pieces of wood, pieces of timber with horses than it is just to drag it around on your own. Okay, so there's change that we see in features and artifacts, and even the way things are manufactured. Back when these things right here were produced, these are some of the oldest points in the region. One of them is a Clovis point, one's a Folsom. They were made very sophisticated, in a sophisticated way. And it looks like there were masters that taught other people to be masters, to do these things. And we don't find a lot of, so-so Clovis artifacts or Folsom artifacts. It looks like somebody made them for everybody. There was a group of people who knew how to do it. We move into the Archaic period, and We still have some types. We still got some pretty interesting looking shapes and sizes and stuff, but the quality dips down a bit. The efficiency goes up as far as making it. Close points, you can make a close point probably in about an hour or so, but then you have to flute it. This is a completely unnecessary step as far as we can tell. We used to think it would help with the hafting process and all that other stuff. But it also is a very difficult thing to do. Other points are like that. There's a point in Texas called an Andice point. It has really deep basal notches. There's little holes that go all the way up in when you're supposed to wrap the sinew around, okay, to make the to haft it onto the shaft, right? Purpose, we can't figure one out. It creates these little thin ears on each side, and they break off the first time you use them. But they continue to use those points until they're spent, which means that they resharpen them and resharpen them, and they're smaller and smaller and smaller, and they couldn't resharpen them anymore, so they tossed them. Okay, without the ears. They didn't need those ears. It broke off the first time they used them. So what was the point? The thing about people and figuring out what people do is that people aren't as predictable as other subjects of science. Okay, like physics is easy. Because you go out there and you have these little things that say, okay, this is going to happen, and this is going to happen, and this is going to happen. Right? Laws, things like that. People are not logical. Well, not all people. Some people are. I'm sure you guys are all logical. I'm sure you've never done anything that was illogical. Okay, so when you're trying to figure out human behavior, there's a lot of things to consider. Right? So sometimes you just got to throw up your hands and say, they were just showing off. Clovis folks were just showing off by adding that flute there. Okay? We have a new type, actually, of point that we discovered in Sunrise Mine. There's an ochre mine up there that we're researching just over the border in Guernsey, Wyoming, or near Guernsey, Wyoming, Hartville, I guess, more precise. And we call it the Sunrise Point. It looks very much like Clovis points, except they don't have flutes. And there's a couple of other technological differences. But the main thing is that they don't have flutes. They appear to be about the same age. We're not sure yet. We're still working on that. Okay, we're doing excavations. I had a field school up there this year, working on looking for habitation sites of where those people lived. So we can find some of those points and date them. Because all of the points that we have so far are from an ochre mine. Does anyone know what ochre is? It's iron oxide that's used for paint by everybody in the past. Every culture around the world that we know of so far has used ochre to paint, to do other things, ceremonial stuff, all sorts of stuff. And this was a mine that was used for about 3,000 years, based on the artifacts, radiation, other than the Sunrise Point, because again, Sunrise we don't have a good date for. But we've got other kinds of points. Plainview, we just found a Plainview up there. We've got a Clovis Point from up there. So we've got everything from about 9,000 years ago to 13,000 years ago, and that's it. A little further away, we're actually trying to figure out places to put the footers for a cover to go over this site to protect it. And a little bit further away from the site, we actually found an early archaic point, okay, that was similarly deposited. These are all points that were put there, as far as we can tell, to pay homage to whoever was the provider of that ochre, as a payment to the spirits or whatever. Okay, they're deposited in a misshapen way. They go up there, they dig for ochre, they get the ochre, and then they put the points in. But while they're digging for ochre, they dig up other points that were put there before. They leave them there, and they put their own in. So they're all mixed up, all over the place in this little ochre mine. Hundreds of these points, Paleo-Indian points. Most of them complete. Okay, they seem to be offerings to the people or the gods who left that ochre for them. So again, this touches on a little bit of the religious beliefs, right? Okay. So manufacturing changes through time. You've got the manufacture of projectile points, for example. A good example, it goes from stone to steel or iron. Okay. We've got subsistence patterns that we can figure out. These are closely related to artifacts and the other patterns that we're going to talk about. All right, so we've got tools that we're looking at to figure these things out. We find a lot of these things here, manos and metates, or grinding stones. Right? The manos are the hand ones, and the metates are the flat one there. And they're used to grind different kinds of grain. That's where those microliths come in handy, because they get stuck in these things. So we can pick them out, figure out what kind of plants were used in the process. What are they grinding in there? Find most of the time seeds. Okay, occasionally some rough plants that are used in some kind of extraction process, for making teas or something like that, or some kind of herbal medicine. Okay, most of the time we find that they're grinding things like sumpweed, lamb's quarters, maygrass, things like that that are used to make flour. And of course later on corn comes in. Okay, it reaches up to these northern climes around 2,000 years ago. That's when the northern flint variety of corn appears. So they're using this corn. Actually, it starts out as a little tiny thing about this big called teosinte. And then they use that teosinte, they select for larger and larger ears and easier to chew, all these things that help us out. And then we get corn. Okay, selective processes. Basically, they're taking over natural selection with artificial selection, creating a new thing. In fact, it was so new that we didn't even know what the ancestor was until recently. So we had DNA to look at. And then we found out that it's teosinte, a grass that grows. And the one that they traced it to is central Mexico, 9 or 10,000 years ago. So when they first started using it. These kinds of things that we look at in paleoethnobotany are called ecofacts. These are just natural things that are in the environment that we find in archaeological sites. So this is another one of those things that we look at besides artifacts. Okay, we look at the seeds, we look at the charcoal. Okay, charcoal is good for dating, but it's also good to tell us what they're using for fuel. Right? What they're using for building material, what they're using for tools, like ladles or bowls. Okay, there's a lot of wooden stuff. It doesn't really survive in most archaeological sites. But where it does survive, where it's either really, really dry all the time or really, really wet all the time, there's a myriad of tools and things that are made out of plants and trees and all sorts of things. Basketry, right? You've got bone tools, all sorts of things that you can find. Corn, beans, and squash was a later addition in the northern climes, but they had been doing corn, beans, and squash for about 8,000 years in Mexico. Of course, nowadays, they've got grains from other parts of the world, just like we have corn now. Okay, corn's a big part of the diet of most of the world. You've got cuisine in China that's based on corn. You've got cuisine in Europe that's based on corn. And this is a Native American domesticate. Same way, Native Americans will use wheat today, right? Or oats, or barley, or whatever. This is a part of the economics as well. Okay? When we look at ancient economics, we're looking at mainly trade, where things come from, how things might have gotten there. Did people actually walk to Yellowstone from Ohio to get their obsidian? Or was it traded from one person to the next, or from one group to the next? until it reached Ohio. These were people. We have an idea that they probably moved around. They didn't all move around like that, though. Okay. But there is some evidence in your ethnographic record that young men, for example, might have been on a quest, and they were supposed to go to a place that was known by older men and bring something back to prove that they were there. Okay? And this could be a part of the trade network that builds up. The biggest trade networks that we had actually were back in the middle woodland period, in the early woodland period, which is about 1,000 to 2,000 years ago. Okay? So people from Ohio got obsidian from Yellowstone and from Mexico. They got copper from the Great Lakes, silver from the Great Lakes, mica from North Carolina, shells for beads from Florida and the Gulf Coast. All sorts of different places that were all connected by a common economic system that was held together, we think, by religion. Because there was also a period where people were burying their dead in mountains all across that entire region. Okay? Now, each of the cultures that were participating in this were a little bit different. They had different customs and things like that. Back in eastern Nebraska, you might find a few people who built mounds, but they're not going to be the same as the ones in Ohio. They're not going to be the same as the ones in New York or Florida. They'll be a little bit different. They might have similar iconographies, but they'll be a little bit different. Ethnographic data shows us that when we're looking at economics, these folks were barterers, archerers. They didn't have money, they traded stuff. So you got obsidian, you want something like mica, you can go trade. Okay? Their systems, their economic systems are based on what we call reciprocity. So we have general reciprocity. You know, I give you something of equal value and you give me it back, right? The equal value back. We trade something of equal value, essentially. And then we have, balance. That's balanced reciprocity. And we got general reciprocity is basically gift giving. You know, elders taking care of youngsters, and then the youngsters turn around and take care of the elders at the end. Okay, and then negative. Negative isn't as common among foragers, but occasionally you have something like that. You know, you want something really bad, something that's not worth as much as that to you, you think you're getting a deal, right? We see it more today, you know, when you're on eBay or something, and you want something and somebody wants you to pay more than you want to pay. That's kind of negative reciprocity there. All right. Linguistics. This is a little further away from archaeology, but we do a lot of testing at sites to determine relationships between different groups. Culturally, to kind of see how that pans out linguistically. So Iroquois groups tend to have a lot of similar cultural things going on. Algonquian groups tend to have a lot of similar things going on. Here in Nebraska, we have Siouan language group, which would include the Lakota, right? We've got Caddoan, believe it or not, from that's known mainly from Texas, but we've got some language groups up here in Nebraska that are related. We've got Algonquian, or Algic. Okay, and when you get back into Wyoming, we add to it Uto-Aztecan toward the west. And Uto-Aztecan, of course, goes all the way down into Mexico. So these different groups are, ones I'm talking about are right about here. Here's Nebraska. This little area right there. You've got the Siouan in the purple, Algonquian, which is your little groups over here, but you've got all of those groups way over there as well. It's a very widespread language group. Okay, again, these are not languages, these are language groups. So within each of these little areas, we've got many different languages. So we know how many different languages were spoken when the Europeans got here? Over 600. Over 600 different languages in a smaller number of language groups, but you can see that's a pretty big number of language groups up there. Religion, a little harder to get to. Beliefs in your head, right? But sometimes they have iconography. Sometimes they have behaviors that are related to religious beliefs. Special places, like the ochre mine. Why are they leaving nice points that they can still use? They're giving something up. For what purpose? Well, we can guess that it was the ochre. Because it was special to them. It's still special to them. We still have Native Americans coming to Sunrise to get ochre, to use it on the reservations or wherever they're going to use them. Okay. So artifacts can tell us a little bit about it. We also can see ethnographically what these types of groups, how they view the world, their worldview, which influences their religion. For example, forager groups tend to be closer to nature. They view themselves as a part of nature. Okay? And so they're going to treat nature as something like a brother. So if they go out and they kill a deer, they're going to thank the spirit of the deer. Right? They don't have a concept of ownership of land. They have a concept of rights to the resources on land, but nobody owns the land. Well, of course, nowadays they do, because we've influenced them. Yeah. But before that, they didn't have that concept. And so that's how it was kind of easy for us to take the land, because they didn't have the idea that you could actually own land. Because the land's there, it's there before you, it's there after you. How do you possibly own it? Okay? So we can look at things like spirituality. Foragers tend to, because they're closer to nature, they tend to believe that everything in nature has a spirit. There's spirit in the rocks, spirits in the trees, spirits in all these other places. This is called animist. Okay? Animist, if they attribute the spirits to have a mind, basically, right? So if the spirits, you can actually interact with them or talk to them or ask them for things, that's animist. Animist is basically the spirits are non-thinking. They don't have a will. They're just there. Things like karma or mana. Okay? These are just spiritual entities that exist. Okay? You can capture that in some cases. So we find things that would have been considered magical to them, where they captured some mana or something. Something sort of akin to when we look at a horseshoe or a rabbit's foot. Okay, that's a similar thing, right? You're attributing this thing to having this spiritual force that's going to give you good luck, right? That's animist. Okay, and some of them were theistic. They may have had many gods, or they may have had one god. Okay, that's something that we can't really get to, but we can get to the idea that they had these gods, or they had this god. And that's where we look to the iconography and the behaviors as far as ritual, right? If they have a medicine wheel, what's that for? I'm asking because I have no idea. But it's spiritual. It's a special place. It may be related to spirits. Okay? Or it might not be. It could be related to mana. or Manitou. One of those non-spiritual forces that are out there, like the Force, right? There's a good example of that. May the Force be with you. That's the idea of this non-persona type of spirits. Rock art and other kinds of art that show images. Okay, a lot of times in rock art we'll be able to recognize clan memberships and spiritual entities. Okay, a lot of times when foragers do a ceremony, they have someone be the spiritual entity. They will don a mask and become that entity. That mask has special powers. It creates that entity within that person. Okay? And so we can see that in the art. A lot in rock art, actually. You see anthropomorphic animals. Those are generally shaman. Those people who don the spiritual energy. Okay? So we can say, okay, well, we see this in this particular culture. They have this particular type of religion. We can't say for sure what their actual beliefs are. We can't say, oh, this shaman is representing this particular spirit that did this, right? Unless somebody tells us. And that's where the ethnographic data comes from. Right? That's where it comes in handy. You've got people who actually told us, in some cases, what these represent. Or even modern people who interpret that from their own culture. Okay? Because we're all people. We all have our own ideas. You might look at something and say, no, that's not a shaman, that's Bigfoot. It could be. I can't tell you no. Yeah. And that's your interpretation. Just like a native has an interpretation, the ancients had an interpretation too. Okay, well we can say in this case, in some of these cases, that these are following along the trajectory of how a particular religion works. So an animist religion is going to have these kinds of iconography. Right? And then burial practices. What do they do with their dead? Do they cremate them? Do they put them on funeral pyres? Do they bury them? Do they gather their bones and wait until the shaman dies and then bury them all together? That happens happened actually in the mound building process. Some of the cultures who built mounds to bury their dead in wouldn't bury anybody until the shaman died. And then everybody who died between that shaman and the last shaman was put in the mound. Okay? Not everywhere. Not all mound building cultures, but some of them. Okay? And these are the kinds of things we can look at. So in this case, the shaman is pretty important in their religious beliefs because he needs to take them to the afterlife. Okay? Sometimes people, when they bury other people with stuff, like their belongings, they have to kill the belongings. Again, everything has a spirit. So in burials, you'll often find broken stuff. Really nice stuff, but broken. On purpose. To be put in there with the dead person. Because you have to kill the spirit of those people too, or send the spirit off, or free the spirit, however you want to look at it. Okay? So we can see that in the archaeological record. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they bury things whole. Maybe that particular culture thinks that this thing will go to the afterlife in this form for the other person to use. Okay? And then just a more scientific note at the end, just for laughs, I guess. Seriation, radiocarbon, luminescence, and dendrochronology are four of the main dating methods that we use in archaeology, not the only ones. We use a lot of different dating methods. And it depends on what we can do and can't do. Seriation is just comparing artifacts. Because in some cases, we might not have anything that's good to date directly, but we have artifacts. and we have artifacts that we know come from a particular time period. So for example, if I find a Clovis point at a site, then I know that that site is probably 13,500 years. Okay, because that's when all the dates for Clovis happen to coalesce. Okay, that's seriation. Radiocarbon is a little different. It's a radiometric method. It's based on how fast or slow something breaks down from a radioactive element to a lesser radioactive element. Okay, radiocarbon works really well because there's a lot of things that are organic at archaeological sites. Okay, if there's no organic stuff, like for really, really old sites, like Neanderthal or something like that, we might use a different method. We might use uranium series, or we might use potassium argon dating. Okay, again, this is the same principle. You're using radioactive material and seeing how long it has been since it was deposited there. Okay, in the case of radiocarbon, radiocarbon is constant in your body while you're alive. Now when you're dead and they bury you, then you stop absorbing it and it slowly decays into nitrogen-13. Okay, and we can measure that. There are different amounts of background radiation in different time periods, so we have to account for that. We call that calibration. And one of the useful things for calibration actually is the last one there, dendrochronology. We'll talk about that in a second. Okay. Next up is luminescence. That's what we have to use in some of the older sites around here because there's nothing to radiocarbon date. All of the organic material has dissipated. So we have grains of feldspar and quartz in sandy situations. And it just so happens that feldspar and quartz absorb sunlight. And then when they're covered up, they release it very slowly through time, and then we can figure out how long ago it's been covered up. And that's what the OSL dating for, optically stimulated luminescence. There are other luminescence techniques. There's one called thermoluminescence. And that's where we date things like pottery, because they absorb heat energy, and then they release it very slowly. Very quickly at first, but then slowly afterwards. And we can measure that. So we can date a site by crunching up a piece of pottery and finding out how much heat is left in it. Okay, in this situation, we actually do the dirt. We take a sample of the dirt at night, basically, at night, and we make sure we don't expose it to any kind of white light because that will reset the whole thing. And then we take it back and we work in a lab that has infrared light because that's the one that doesn't reset it. Okay, and then we can figure out how long ago that dirt was covered up and not exposed. Right, cool. As far as accuracy, the luminescence process, because there's a lot of different factors involved, we have error rates that are fairly high. Radiocarbon, we used to have fairly high, well, relatively speaking. We used to have like plus or minus 300 or 500 for a date that was 5,000 years old. That's a very high error range. Okay, but since we got calibration techniques involved, we don't accept dates that have a higher error rate than 30 years. We reject those dates and start over. Okay. And dendrochronology helps us out with that, because dendrochronology is tree rings. Anyone know anything about tree rings? For most species, one per year. Every year. Bad years, they're smaller. Good years, they're a little bit wider. Okay? And so we count those. It's a very simple process. Counting tree rings. Okay, and then you overlap those. So say you have a tree that died 100 years ago, and you have a 100-year-old tree, they're going to overlap a little bit. Okay, and we can measure that. Regionally specifically though, because the size of the rings is based on what the environmental conditions are at that particular location. So we can't use tree rings from Germany to figure out ages from here. We have to use tree rings from here. Okay? It's a lot easier in places where you have either really, really dry or really, really wet conditions, because you have more trees that go back further. Okay. Desert Southwest, talking about Arizona, Utah, Colorado, the Four Corners region. We have a tree ring sequence that goes back 12,000 years, unbroken, because they have trees that are preserved in that desert conditions. That's not the longest one though. The longest one is in Germany, of all places. Does anyone know it's in Germany? There's no deserts there. There are things called bogs. Lots of bogs. And they preserve trees. And they go back about 14,000 years. That's the longest one we have so far. Most of them were broken, like here. Okay, we have some time periods that we're looking at in those cases. But eventually, hopefully, we'll get trees that fill in all the gaps. All right? Dendrochronology, because trees are organic, we can radiocarbon date samples from known dates and then see how far off the radiocarbon dating is. And that brings the error rates down. That's what we call calibration. Okay. So it accounts for the varying levels of carbon-14 in the environment at any given time. Okay. So it helps us out a lot. Alrighty. Any questions? Yeah.
What is your theory on why Native Americans never developed the wheel?
My hypothesis is they never needed it.
Yeah, thank you.
Why Native Americans never developed the wheel? The answer is it depends on where you ask about. The Inca had wheels, but they didn't use them for carts or transportation. Believe it or not, they use them for toys. They put them on toys so little kids can walk around with toys. So the concept was there. Okay? It's not something that they couldn't think of. It's just they didn't need it. If you think about Incan roads, they have extensive road systems from back then, back in the 1400s, 1500s, all across from Chile all the way up to Ecuador. Roads everywhere. But if you look at those roads, they're not like the roads we have. Some of them have stairs. Some of them have little rope bridges. Places where wheels probably wouldn't do very well. They were a mountainous environment. They had to cross the Andes, basically. So wheels wouldn't have been very useful as a transportation tool for them.